Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Eppiheimer. I am the founder and CEO of Threefold Yes Consulting. We provide executive coaching, team development, and organizational change support to companies across multiple different industries. And I have a background in the creative arts in nearly 2 decades as a healthcare executive, and then more recently as an entrepreneur, as a speaker, and as a coach. And throughout all the different phases of my career and in all the leaders that I've worked with, usually one of the top three things on their lists of challenges that they're working to get better at is around the art and science of effective feedback. And this is true for new leaders who are just getting started in their roles. It's true for people in the middle of their careers. And yes, it's even true for people in the senior most positions of their organizations. And so we are going to spend some time together in this course really unpacking some of the challenges with feedback and some of the opportunities to get better at it along the way. So let me walk you through some of the goals for our course today. So in this first section, we're going to discuss the common feedback situations that you face. And yes, we're going to get into some of the mistakes that likely you've made or you've experienced along the way. And then we'll dig into, in our second section, some of the best practices for giving feedback. It's often very helpful to have a framework to work from, to be able to understand what works well and have something to give you confidence in the interactions that you're having. And then finally, this is not something that can simply be an academic exercise. You really need to put it into practice and learn by doing. And so we'll talk about how you can apply the art and science of feedback in your work environment. We have a handout available that you can follow along on this, and I'll refer to that as we go through the course. And you can also just simply grab a piece of paper or a tablet and take some notes along the way. But the more actively engaged you are in this process, the more likely you are to benefit from it. So speaking of that, I'd like you to grab your worksheet or grab a piece of paper, and we're going to start to think through some of the common feedback scenarios that you may face. So just take a minute and write down as many situations as you can imagine in which you might need to give or receive feedback. So you can pause the video here and then come back and we'll talk through it. Okay. So hopefully you've made your list. It's pretty long. I'm guessing that some of these items are probably on your list. Now, the common challenge that many people face is that they think of feedback as the annual or the biannual performance review. And certainly feedback can happen in that situation, but if it's the only place that it's happening, you know you're probably getting into trouble. And oftentimes the performance review might relate to a performance improvement plan. So it's the first time someone's getting feedback that something's going wrong and they're working on it to improve. Ideally, feedback is happening in multiple ways across the course of your work. And this could be in challenging situations. It could be in response to a conflict. It could be based on some behavior issues that the leader is experiencing. Maybe there was a big mistake or a failure on a project or something someone was working on. And those are certainly situations where you might get feedback, but it's also really important to be giving feedback in more neutral or positive circumstances as well. So maybe you finished a big project and a lot of things went well, and you talk about those and you talk about some things you want to do better in the future. Maybe you're giving routine and regular praise. And probably one of the most important areas in which feedback can be really important is those ongoing skills and career development conversations where you're simply building rapport, relationship, and trust with the people you're working with around the positive things and their aspirations for the future. And that type of feedback can actually build trust and camaraderie in a way that when you have more challenging conversations, you're more prepared for it along the way. So another big challenge that we have with feedback is that we often get stuck in between the Goldilocks principle. Our feedback can come off a little bit too hot or too cold, and we're working really hard to get it just right. So I'd like you to take another moment with your worksheet and pause and think about all the mistakes that you've either experienced or maybe done yourself when giving feedback. And this could be coming on too hot or too strong, or this could be maybe not getting it quite right in terms of giving the feedback so that it can actually be heard and be effective. So pause now and take a second, and then we'll come back to it. Okay. So let's see what some of the things are on your list. So when you're trying to get feedback just right, oftentimes will come on too hot. And this is where we're focusing only on the negative. Maybe something goes wrong and we immediately criticize someone in a public setting, which is embarrassing for them and usually not very helpful. Sometimes we will generalize. We'll tell people that they're always doing or never doing something in a way that isn't specific enough and tends to be a little bit too personalized. A lot of times we are so worried about the feedback that we're about to give that we're not really listening to the other person because we're so in our heads around the thing that we're going to say. And then sometimes we just give feedback on the fly without really being thoughtful and intentional about it. And oftentimes that can go wrong. And then one of the final ways that we're all very familiar with is the feedback sandwich. We give just a little bit of positive feedback. We say the negative thing that we really intended to do, and then we try to end with some positivity as well. Generally speaking, this is not the most effective strategy, and we'll talk about some better ones in a moment. But we can also come on too cold in the feedback we offer. I know when I was younger in my career, I was sensitive about hurting people's feelings, and I would give feedback in a way that they didn't even know that they received it. So being too vague can be quite challenging. We also may want to avoid conflict or negative emotions, and so we'll shy away from saying the thing that we really need to say. Sometimes we'll wait too long after an event. So if something happens and then 2 months later I bring it up in a feedback conversation, it can be quite unsettling for the person receiving it. And it's really important to be kind of proximate to the moment where you're giving feedback around. And then consistency and follow through. So if I'm only giving you feedback once or twice a year, it's going to be jarring, even if I'm doing a pretty good job with it and trying to be positive. And this is the opposite of the feedback sandwich, which is that feedback starvation, where you're withholding it in a way that is making it less effective over time. And then finally, for this first section, I'd like you to think about your individual feedback scenarios. So as we went through that entire list, you may not cover all of those specific items, but there are likely 2 or 3 specific scenarios where you're likely giving feedback and creating a scene with the people that you're working with. And we'll talk about the idea of the scene in just a bit in the second section. So take a minute right now and work through who's the scene in the scene with you. So describe it in as much possible in detail as possible. So who they are, what the scenario might be, what your relationship is to that person. Where does the scene take place? Maybe it takes place in person in a formal office. Maybe you're having a more casual conversation out at lunch. Maybe you're in a virtual setting. And then what are the emotional stakes of the scene? Oftentimes the feedback comes with high emotional stakes. And so it's important to acknowledge those and note those. Sometimes it's actually a much lower stake, more casual conversation. So it's interesting to think through the scenarios that you face and some of the common mistakes that you may have demonstrated or experienced along the way. And what I'd like you to do as we wrap up this first section is just note these things out, think through them a little bit. And then as we move to the next section of our discussion, we'll come back to these common scenarios and help you to put them into practice to help them to make you more effective along the way. So it's great to get started on the question of giving feedback. It is a common challenge that people at every phase of their career struggle with, think through, need to get better on. And in our next section, we're going to really dig into some of the best practices to help us become more effective and thoughtful in delivering feedback to those that we work with.